Just a heads up, our Animal Man Part 2 episode, the recording was lost. So it is delayed, and we will return to Animal Man probably in a couple months, but we'll be back to Animal Man as soon as we can. In the meantime, we're reviewing a couple other comics, so enjoy this review of Wonder Woman Earth 1.
Reimagining whole comic book universes thanks to Franco and its symptom baseball. Thought legend with native chaos. Grant Morrison.
Hello and welcome to the Morrison Run, the podcast where we read and review everything written by Grant Morrison. My name is Leon.
My name is Bertie.
And I'm Angwin.
And today we are reading and reviewing Wonder Woman Earth 1, drawn by Yannick Paquette.
Gangsta Grizzle!
Wonder Woman Earth 1 was part of DC's Earth 1 initiative, which is...
Sorry. Yes. Earth 1 initiative.
Yeah, which is really interesting because the Earth 1 sort of started in 2010, I believe. It's a bunch of books. They're set in an alternate reality, sort of like Marvel's Ultimate Universe, where they were released as these graphic novels, like 100-page graphic novels. Like, they weren't released in single issues. And it started in 2010 with Superman Earth 1, and then there was Batman Earth 1, and then Wonder Woman came out in 2016. But it was a bit of a weird thing and like a fail. It maybe could be considered a failure because it kind of came out around the same time as the New 52, and the New 52 was also reimagining and making a lot of changes to the DC universe. But then you also had Earth 1, which was doing something similar and not in a particularly different way. Because especially to start with, and even though I've heard they're very good stories, Superman Earth 1 and Batman Earth 1 are both pretty standard as origin stories, from what I understand.
Yeah.
Superman Earth 1, to me, sounds like almost like Man of Steel, just a slightly more realistic and gritty version of the Superman origin.
I think that was kind of the pitch to begin with, Earth 1 being like these characters in the real world, but then Action Comics by Grant Morrison was sort of doing the same thing in the New 52, like a kind of working class Superman being kind of this, like, you know, facing real issues and stuff, I believe. So they were sort of competing almost, trying to like not do the same thing, but also having the same kind of pitch to begin with, is what I've heard.
Yeah. And the graphic novel sort of format meant these were coming out for ages, like they took ages to finish up. All of them were meant to have 3 volumes, and I don't think they properly all finished up until 2021. But it's really weird because you had those coming out the gate, and then it took a while for Wonder Woman to get her Earth 1 story in 2016 with this volume 1. But this one, I wouldn't say, it doesn't feel like super gritty in the same way that those other ones seem, at least in terms of their vibe. Obviously, we'll get into that as we talk properly about the story. But this, to me, very much just feels like Grant Morrison doing their version of the Wonder Woman origin. Like, it doesn't feel like it's meant to be a super different take, alternative to the main universe. It just feels like Grant Morrison going, okay, I'm getting to tell a Wonder Woman origin. This is what I think it should be.
Yeah, I can't quite put my finger on it, but I know that this is an origin borrowing from a lot of Wonder Woman's history, but it doesn't feel like the same as All-Star Superman that's also trying to pay an homage to Superman's history. I don't know if it's in the tone, maybe that's why I feel like it's different, but
well, I think where All-Star Superman attempts to sort of take so many elements of the history and put it into one grand epic story where Superman encounters so many different characters. This, so many different characters and so many different situations. This is just an origin story that is taking thematic inspiration from so much of Wonder Woman's history and a lot of characters and elements from Wonder Woman's history, but it's streamlining them into one origin story. And I wouldn't say that All-Star Superman is like streamlined in the same way.
I guess similar to what you were saying is maybe because it's the beginning of a longer story and All-Star Superman is kind of its own standalone. I'd say that at least the first volume of Earth 1 Wonder Woman plays it kind of straight. Like, it doesn't throw in anything too crazy. It's a story that most people, the overall story is something most people have seen before. Kind of that, rebellious child wants to leave the small world that they've been forced to live in by their parent. And, yeah. So I think that it's very readable because of that. But I'd understand why it doesn't feel similar to All-Star Superman, at least in that way.
Shall we go into the story recap?
The beginning of the story gives us the mythos of the Amazonian island, which we get the impression at some point in the story is like within or in the center of the Bermuda Triangle. Perhaps in a way for them to hide from the world and all that sort of thing, right? And it's almost like the Remus and Romulus story of Rome. It's that but for the Amazon island. Basically, Hercules, the mythic hero of Greece, has like locked all the Amazons, or I guess perhaps not at that time the Amazons, in a cage, and is kind of, I don't know, just like he's got Hippolyta, who's the queen of the Amazons, on her knees. I don't know if he's whipping her, but he's really, I don't know. It's like it's quite graphic, and it's not the most fun thing to read, right? And he's really degrading her, which I guess will kind of become a bit of a theme for the rest of the story, but not in the same way. I think in a fun way they're able to subvert kind of the brutality of the mythos and the history of the Amazon island into. I think Grant Morrison writes into like a fun cultural thing, but then the overarching story is that Diana is on trial, and we come to learn later that an Amazon trial is not the same as the trials as they are in the rest of the world. What the Amazonians would call man's world, the world that we live in, and is instead a sort of rethreading of the fate of a character, in this case Diana, wherein Diana, holding on to the lasso of truth, she and a few other humans give their witness testimony of Diana's transgression from the rules of the Amazonians, which is essentially like finding a man crashing onto the island, not bringing him to the Amazonians, not having him killed, but instead saving his life and taking him back home. There are other points during the story where she's able to take him home because she breaks another rule in part of like this traditional sort of theater that they put on every year, where the character playing Hercules gets beaten by a character playing Hippolyta, which happened in the mythos of the Amazonian story. But generally speaking, it's the fact that Diana saves a man's life, shows compassion, which perhaps her mother and the rest of her people wouldn't show, and then goes to our world for a bit and becomes almost a member of a sorority, and I guess gives her 2 cents on the world that we live. But essentially, the origin story is that she becomes Wonder Woman because she can.
Yeah, in this version, the Wonder Woman title is something that's like from the Amazon mythos. It's to do with this competition that they have where you can like win the Wonder Woman title. She doesn't really like. There's not like a moment in this, I'd say, where she like really like becomes Wonder Woman.
Yeah.
Especially not to the outside world. I'm sure we'll get something like that in the coming volumes.
Yeah,
but
but
I do like how the Wonder Woman title is used in that way, and also her costume is something that's completely Amazonian and is in line with what all the other Amazons are wearing. And I think that really works because a part of Wonder Woman's history that's a little bit difficult to reconcile in the modern day is that she wears the American flag, and the Wonder Woman name tends to be something that's like given to her by Americans, and stuff like that, and that always feels weird to me. It's just a part of the character that, on one hand, is so intrinsic to her, and especially in how she looks, but doesn't quite line up with how the character is written or viewed today. But this version sort of rejects that by making the title and the costume completely tied to the Amazons, which is a similar thing to what Grant Morrison did with Superman in All-Star Superman. They made it so that the outfit had nothing to do with US nationalism and was just the outfit would be normal in Krypton.
I think similarly, I really like how her traditional Amazonian outfit is obviously chosen by her, and is, I guess, I don't know, you guys should elaborate on this, but perhaps breaks a bit the mold somewhat, because she's wearing like full leggings and what seems to look like trainers almost, right? Rather than her like thigh-high boots and, you know, like more, I don't even know how you describe like the rest of her outfit, but you know what I'm saying, where she actually gets her more traditional outfit from her friends on Earth. I think one of the characters, one of her sorority sisters, describes it as a sort of hazing, her outfit, but she comes to own it in a sort of way, or at least a version of that outfit, which I think is really cool. I think the whole Wonder Woman becoming a sorority girl, I think it adds kind of a cool like side to her character, because she doesn't fully fit in, but there are bits where she goes to a bar and talks to her friends, which I think is cool, and like it doesn't fully fit within the tone of the story and the timeline. Like I don't know exactly when that happened, but I do think it's funny. I think it's cool.
Yeah, well, she first gets a new costume, from the sorority. Obviously, her friend there is a character, Beth Candy, who is a version of Etta Candy from the classic comics. I don't quite know the reason for the name change. Obviously, both of them are short for Elizabeth, but I'm sure there's some reason for that name change. But she first gets her altered costume from them, but then at the very end, the Fates weave her a new costume, which is basically the classic Wonder Woman costume.
Mm-hmm.
But still, I would say, even this version of the classic Wonder Woman costume, the stars on it aren't the stars of the American flag. They're more like Greek stars. Like, they're like... They look more like how stars were drawn in ancient art, rather than how they look on the American flag. So again, that reclaims it away from that American nationalism. The art throughout this whole thing, I think, is pretty beautiful. And the paneling is incredible. Every page is like designed so well and has such interesting panel layouts, where it has the lasso of truth as like a border that weaves throughout the page. And that detail is paid in every page.
Yeah, to begin with, we see when Hercules is... when we see the Amazonians escape the oppression of Hercules, we also see these like fractured vases as panel layouts, which depict the same myth, but in a slightly different way, which kind of shows the passing of time from this part of the comic to, I think it's 3,000 years later when it's set. I just thought that was quite a creative way of displaying a flashback that I've never seen before, really.
Yeah, and it also creates a contrast because the version of Themyscira in this comic, the Amazon island, is shown as opposed to like the George Perez version, which, as much as I love a lot of the George Perez stuff, the George Perez version portrays a very stereotypical image of an ancient Greek island, where they're all wearing togas and there's like ancient temples and stuff. Whereas this version of Themyscira, they have been progressing in their technology and everything separate from man's world. So it's like a sci-fi paradise where they've got like flying cars and
a little bit like Wakanda and Black Panther.
Yeah, actually, yeah.
hmm hmm
They
I
ride
think
kangaroos as
the
well. Sorry.
that is that is really cool. What they call them kangas, or is that just like an actual name for a kangaroo? Like they do this sort of kangaroo jousting. I think this is a great segue to bring up the kind of the culture. Like Grant Morrison kind of weaves this very, I think, funny but also kind of like rich culture for the Amazonians, where obviously you have the the yearly jousting where they reenact Hippolyta fighting back Hercules and fighting away from the oppression of man's world and creating a paradise, wherein one person wears this lion skin over their head. Of very famously, obviously, Hercules kills this mythic lion and wears its skin as armor, and this is repurposed as a piece of Amazonian history, almost as like the garms of the oppressor. And this person always loses. I'm not personally sure. I don't know if the reader is meant to be sure of if Diana always plays Hercules in the story. During this volume, she does, and she, as a part of her transgression is that she, because she is stronger than Marla, the champion of the Amazonians, and everyone else, she actually beats Marla, right? Whilst it's her job to be beaten. But I think one of my favorite parts of this culture is that at one point, the man that Diana saves,
Steve Trevor.
Steve Trevor, right? He obviously is very thankful for Diana. At one point where they are, waiting out for a time for what Diana thinks to go home, but it's actually for the U.S. military to come and try capture her, right? Trevor Stevens is Steve Trevor is very grateful, and Diana hands him what I think is a dog collar, because in Amazonian culture, the way to show gratitude and strength is to like get on all fours in a dog collar and be grateful, which I thought was very fun. I thought that was a cool addition to this sort of culture.
Yeah,
And it's not portrayed as submissive at all. Like in one of the earliest panels, when Hippolyta is describing man's world, there is a lady put on a leash licking from a dog bowl in what seems like some sort of like medieval street, while a man is like holding the leash, and it's kind of I think it very much kind of it flips that, and I don't know why that is. I mean, obviously, it seems like Hippolyta has kind of crafted all this culture, so maybe that's something that she thinks is really cool. But I just thought that was a very creative and fun addition to this sort of culture.
It did confuse me a bit, that contradiction with submission seemingly being expected in sort of both cultures. I didn't quite understand.
I think the idea is that in man's world, submission is kind of a bad thing, because a masculine man has to be dominant, right? Well, perhaps Hippolyta is saying that we reject this very, like masculine and patriarchal view of submission, and instead it's actually just, it's a powerful position to be in. Which you could argue is tone deaf. Like potentially, you could say that maybe as a writer, Grant Morrison is going like, oh, actually, women love being submissive, or it's a point of power, which maybe not all women would like identify with. But I think that the fact that it's not looked down on, I think that's still very interesting. I think it's
I think this comic is somewhat controversial, because I think those sort of those submission elements are tied to this, like I would say, a theme of bondage, which talking about the Wonder Woman history that's been there from the start of Wonder Woman. The guy who invented Wonder Woman, William Moulton Marston, I believe, he was like a feminist and a freak, and he was really into
Damn,
like bondage.
son, where'd you find this?
He was really into like bondage and stuff, and he was in like a 3-way relationship with 2 women or something. I don't know all the details, but he wrote these Wonder Woman stories that they fulfilled his sexual fantasies, but at the same time were very feminist in how Wonder Woman broke her bondage and dominated men, and it's clearly Grant Morrison who is interested in that part of Wonder Woman and is reclaiming that for this new version. And I think a lot of this comic is somewhat controversial, has some mixed reviews, and I think it's because a lot of people are uncomfortable with some of those elements. Especially when you see certain pages of women submitting or being tied up. But I personally think that there's clearly a point to it. We're not just reveling in seeing women put in those positions. It's presented to show like a clear alternative to patriarchy and man's world, as the Amazons call it.
Mm-hmm.
And it's meant to be like a transgressive thing. I understand I understand if people aren't uncomfortable with even seeing it, like that's a personal thing, but I think that some people jump to this being a sexist comic when I think that's not giving it enough grace to attempt to read what it's trying to do.
I think, the listeners should definitely take the time to read it for themselves and draw their own conclusions. But at least the impression that I got is that the portrayals of relationships in this are very... I would say I wouldn't say they're transgressive because a lot of them just exist in the world we live in. But I would say that the fact that like these sorts of because there are kind of panels of these big feasts where like there is kissing and all this sort of stuff, but you don't really get an impression at any point that there is like a dominant member of the relationship and a submissive member. I do think that perhaps a problem with relationships under patriarchy is the fact that the question of like, oh, who's a man in the relationship, even in like a gay or lesbian relationship, there's always that expectation that one person is dominant and that must be male, and that one is submissive and that must be female. While like we have Marla and Diana, who we don't get the impression that either is more dominant or more submissive. They're both just warrior Amazonians, and the same with Hippolyta and Nubia, who seems to be like the right hand to Hippolyta. Equally, even though Hippolyta is the queen or the leader of the Amazonians, we don't get the impression that she has this sort of like domination over like Nubia. And the same with several other characters that go unnamed during the volume. I do think that it's that like a lot of these things are portrayed like the sort of bondage as not benign necessarily, but kind of divorced from traditional, patriarchal expectations of bondage, right? Where it's not like one person is gaining pleasure from being dominant and one is gaining pleasure from being submissive. It's just kind of part of like relationships or culture in this world.
I agree. I think you said it exactly. I do think sometimes, even though the art in this is often very gorgeous, I think there are certain panels where those elements of it and the depiction of women feel a slight bit too much like we're reveling in the sexual element or over-sexualizing the woman character. But I think mostly the art's gorgeous. I just think there's a couple moments where maybe the art is at fault for how some people might read this as being a sexist.
Yeah, I really I think one of the characters that I've never read a story with Beth Candy in before, but I found Beth Candy like a great point of comic relief and also a very fun perspective on the Amazonian world, where Steve Trevor seems very intimidated by it, understandably, because he's a soldier or whatever, and every single time he's there, he's in a point of distress. The first time he's crash landed trying to fly over, and the second time he throws up because he's been turned to stone by Medusa, right? I guess for context, Medusa is sent by Hippolyta to the man's world to force Diana to come back, right? But like, unlike Steve Trevor, who seems very intimidated and scared by it all, Beth seems almost at home. She finds it very like she finds it very cool. Like, I mean, obviously she somewhat glorifies it, perhaps because what she's in university and has a kind of a juvenile view of mythos, which I think is played for comedy. But I think the fact that she walks in and all the Amazonians are like kind of looking down on her because of her weight, she just seems like very at home, and she finds it all kind of alien, but also just like very fun and very interesting. I think she's really funny, and I think the perspective she brings, unlike, is perhaps, I guess, because it's less professional. I just think it adds like kind of a very almost like comedically cutting attack on the expectations and the kind of code that Hippolyta is built out. I think a lot of the characters, because what Steve Trevor and the Amazonians, they're all kind of militant and they're all serious in that way. Having a character who isn't like that, I think in a way she's like, through her kind of making a joke out of a lot of things, or she's able to, I don't know, find interesting ways to criticize the sort of, in quote unquote paradise that Hippolyta has created.
Yeah, that's I agree with that a lot. I like that Etta even, like, she says, I happen to think my body's just about the best it's ever been. So I like that she stands up for herself in that way. I will say I'm not sure how I feel about how all the Amazons look like models and then are clearly uncomfortable with Beth's body, and I don't know, without men it won't become fat and we'll all just end up looking like supermodels. That's like the one element that I didn't really like.
I think that perhaps the story struggles with balancing criticizing Hippolyta's world and also criticizing our own. There are times when, like, it's clearly trying to criticize our world with, Hercules, and then the fact that all the soldiers are very clearly very manipulative and they're all very masculine and all very militant. And then in this scenario, it's clear that we're meant to find it strange that such an isolated society is looking down on something that we would see as normal, in our world. And maybe like, if I'm giving the story a wide berth, we're meant to say that the perfect world isn't what I guess is a total matriarchy or what we have as a total patriarchy, and maybe there are problems with both. But I also think that I'm having to then assume then that under a matriarchy that of like fat women are looked down upon, which I don't know if they necessarily would be. So I think I agree that it is kind of a weird point that the story makes.
Yeah, but I still think it's clearly thought out, and I think a lot of these elements, when I say we're giving it a wide berth and we're giving it grace, it's because, frankly, like, Grant Morrison is a queer writer who is in some way, like, it is writing a clearly thought out version of, I would say, I don't know, you could call this a queer story. I mean, like, Amazon Island is like lesbian paradise. So I just think if someone who was a straight man had written this story and included a lot of the same elements, first of all, I don't think it would be written in exactly the same way. I mean, no one's going to write it exactly like Grant Morrison, but I think I would be more critical of some of those elements. But because it's Grant Morrison and I know who Grant Morrison is, I feel a lot more confident in their goals and their intentions in writing a story like this.
Yeah, but what would you say about like the sort of Amazonian culture?
I mean, I was a bit, because I like to begin with, I feel like you're rooting for them, right? Like you see them escape oppression and then you want to be on their side, but then we shift to Diana as the protagonist that is breaking their rules and feeling oppressed by this society. So I found that quite a dramatic shift in the story and tone, and I was a bit like, who am I following? Who am I supposed to be rooting for? And I think, I think just that the narrative shifts almost suddenly, and I was like a bit lost on who's in the right kind of during the midpoint in the story. And I think it might take until the end of this series, it's a 3-book series, to really understand Hippolyta as a character, because we almost see her break during her trial, but then maybe she was being manipulative and trying to keep Diana on Amazon and keep her in this like world where she feels she can't express her compassion and stuff. So
well, I think it's like such a classic story in fiction, but even in the real world, it's like the parent who has been through so much, like the oppressed parent who's been through so much, who sets these harsh rules for their child and creates an environment to protect against the things they went through. But then a child who doesn't quite understand that and is transgressing their parent instead. And I think that's a classic story. I think we're meant to root for both of them in their own way and meant to feel both of them emotionally. Towards the end, obviously, Hippolyta is in the wrong in some ways in how she manipulated and lied to Diana about how she was created. Basically, she told Diana that she was made from clay, but it wasn't true, and like Hippolyta made Diana with like the DNA of Hercules to be the ultimate warrior, but she ended up not being that. So obviously she's probably in the wrong there, but we're still meant to feel her emotionally and understand how she got there, and that's why that opening sequence where we see Hercules' oppression of the Amazons is like so important in just setting up the context for this whole story and how they got to the place they are.
Yeah. I guess similar to what you were saying, because what I do think it's a very simple story. Like I guess this is an opportunity for me to bring up this metaphor. I was thinking, in my head I kept comparing it to Tangled, but there are so many stories that it's similar to. Like you were just saying. I think arguably the fact that it's kind of a story we've already seen before could be seen to be a weakness. I completely understand why Grant Morrison would write it this way. Maybe Grant Morrison's trying to play it safe, right? Because Grant Morrison isn't a woman and would not be able to write a more Grant Morrison story from this perspective. But compared to all the, like most of the other stories we've done, like Kill Your Boyfriend is generally speaking the same story, right? A transgressing child, in a world, or in their own sort of world, and with Animal Man, all these other stories we've gone through. Like I think my expectation of Grant Morrison and the way that they play with narrative a bit more. I think that like if I read this and you didn't tell me it was written by Grant Morrison, I wouldn't bat an eye, because I wouldn't say that like the kind of medium or like the narrative is really messed with that much, which I think is fine, because I think that perhaps Grant Morrison didn't want to end up writing like kind of a bad story, because I wouldn't say this is bad at all. I'd say this is very solid, right? But wouldn't end up writing a bad story if they took too many risks and then ended up kind of, like I was saying before, becoming a bit tone deaf with the characters. But I would say that it's a story that most readers will have seen before, and I'm not really reinventing the wheel, if you know what I mean.
I don't quite feel that. I mean, Grant Morrison doesn't strike me as someone that's that worried about taking risks. Like, and I think that, yes, in some ways this is a story we've seen before, but we've seen it before in Wonder Woman. This is the Wonder Woman origin again.
Yeah.
Like, it can't be that different. And also, it's only part one. I think there's a lot where this story can go in terms of reconciling the ideology and the culture of the Amazons with the culture of the rest of the world. And the way that is going to be reconciled, I'm really interested to see, because that's just sort of an ongoing point of tension in most Wonder Woman stories. But this is just a 3-part Wonder Woman story that has an ending. So I'm really interested to see how it's tied up and reconciled. And I think that all the themes it's playing with, in terms of the bondage element, Wonder Woman's history, all these elements do make it feel new. And I definitely felt the Grant Morrison writing, even if it's not a super crazy story structure, it just feels very Morrison to me, even just aesthetically. Also, it does have a non-linear narrative as well, where it's told through flashbacks in the trial. And so just something I felt needed to be pointed out, and maybe we should have mentioned it earlier, but in this version, Steve Trevor is black. Steve Trevor is not black in any other version. I don't know if you knew that, Engwin.
No, I didn't. I think that's a very good choice, because I think it's central to his character and kind of the way the narrative plays out, actually.
It is.
Yeah.
And I would say Steve Trevor is a character who's, he was played by Chris Pine in the Wonder Woman movie. Like, he's so tied to Wonder Woman. And Steve Trevor, the traditional story is he crash lands on Paradise Island. He's working for the US military, and he's Wonder Woman's gateway into man's world, and often their lovers as well. But Steve Trevor isn't the classic version, who is like white and blonde. He's never that interesting. If you read the George Perez version, which is like some of the most famous Wonder Woman comics from the 1980s, which retells her origin and everything, George Perez uses Steve Trevor because he's such an important part of the origin. But after that, he's not that interested in using him, and he's just like not in that run that much, and because he's just not interesting enough character. But making him black actually adds a lot of complexities to the story, and I think makes him a lot more interesting in this version. Because of the sort of intersectionality. Hippolyta preaches all these things about, like, we're so oppressed by man's world, and basically suggests that all men are evil. She doesn't. No, I would say in some way she does kind of suggest that. Diana does. Yeah, Diana doesn't believe that, but in some way Hippolyta does. But we see a black man who also has been oppressed by man's world, the white patriarchy. And I think that adds so much complexity, because it says, if you make it so binary about the ideology of the Amazons versus the patriarchy, it feels so, oh, well, obviously I'm going to root for the Amazons. But then when you make the representative of man's world a black man who is also a victim of the white patriarchy and man's world, then it makes it so much more complex. And it is a central part of the story because, as you mentioned earlier, Wonder Woman offers him this sort of chance for, submission, where she shows him this dog collar, and then it sort of cuts away from that. And obviously, Steve Trevor's so taken aback by that, because that comes across as really racist. And I will say, I think that should have been more on the nose, because we see Wonder Woman talking to Beth and saying, "Oh, I should apologize to Steve and stuff." And she also says, "I didn't even realize," or something like that. But I think it should have just been slightly more clear, because I have seen that page of her holding the collar posted around of like, what the hell is this? And that's just taken out of context, obviously. But I think if afterwards the story was slightly more clear about that was wrong of Wonder Woman to do, Wonder Woman didn't understand the history of slavery and did that. But it was wrong. I don't know. I think it should have just been slightly more clear about that. But obviously later on, Steve does mention the sort of history of oppression and slavery as well at the Amazon trial. So it is talked about explicitly. I just think it could have been slightly more explicit.
Yeah, I think that's fair. Oh, man.
A couple other details in the story I just wanted to point out. When we see, there's a shot. There's a couple points where we see some of the Amazons, and one of them is dressed up, but like, Wonder Girl Donna Troy. I don't think it really matters whether or not it actually is Donna Troy, but it's just a fun little reference. And then Hippolyta's sort of right-hand man, and I would think presumably lover as well, is called Nubia, who I think when this comic came out, Nubia hadn't had her sort of resurgence that she's had in recent years. So that was quite a deep cut of Morrison to put Nubia, who is from old Wonder Woman stories. But in this story, she takes the role of... There's a character in the Perez run called Philippus, who is typically, like, Hippolyta's, as I said, like, right-hand man and lover, but Morrison just sort of replaces Philippus with Nubia. I don't think that's necessary, but it's a nice little ode to more of the Wonder Woman history.
Yeah. I think narratively, not to move back, but narratively, maybe one of the reasons why I'm not as impressed is because I've seen this story before, even in a similar medium. Like I was talking about this before the episode, but in like One Piece has an arc, probably like it's probably done a bit longer because everything's a bit longer in One Piece, but I'd say I think that arc is a bit controversial because it takes place during arguably the biggest saga in One Piece, in between two of the biggest arcs, and then it's kind of like main character Luffy goes from being in a place with lots of conflict, between two places, lots of conflict, and kind of a smaller story. It's obviously very important and has a lot of character building, but I do think kind of an Amazonian island story. I think in One Piece it's played fine, but I would say that because the main character is still a male in that story, albeit like a kind of a strange, like so aloof that he completely is like alien almost character, still a male. And I mean, similar jokes are played in both stories, but I do think that I think it's a very classic narrative, and I think that I mean this is the Wonder Woman story, and I do think that trying to do something too different steals away from the fact that this is kind of there's a reason why this is classic, if you know what I'm saying. There's a reason why this is the story, and to change it too much, I think you kind of like lose a lot of the importance of the character.
Yeah, I mean, I really liked this because it felt like a really great version of the Wonder Woman origin. Wonder Woman's origin is interesting. It's been rewritten so many times. Every time DC does a reboot, Batman and Superman always sort of seem to continue on. Like when Crisis on Infinite Earths happened, yeah, they did year one, but apart from year one, it flashed back to the modern day, and it's basically the same Batman as pre-Crisis. Whereas Wonder Woman in pre-Crisis, and then in New 52, and then in Reboot, every time they're like, okay, we need to tackle her origin again. And I think there's so many... I think it's just she's like seems a much less defined character than like Batman and Superman. And I think a lot of writers don't quite know how to tackle her. And there's always a constant cycle of people messing up her origin and it having to be rewritten back to a more stable place. But I think this is a really great version of her origin, that it takes the original and a lot of those bondage themes and queer elements from the original version of Wonder Woman, puts in a lot of the Perez elements with the Amazon history, George Perez being who wrote Wonder Woman in the 80s, and then puts that all in a modern context through a uniquely Grant Morrison lens. and I really enjoyed it as an origin. I'm really interested to see where it goes. I think it could definitely mess it up in the next 2 volumes, but I'm interested to see whether or not it does that. What are your thoughts, Bertie?
Yeah.
Well, my thoughts overall on the book. Sorry.
Yeah, or anything in particular as well.
I mean, for me, I think I don't what prevents this from being maybe like one of my preferred Grant Morrison stories is because we do have like a deliberately awkward dialogue due to the language and cultural barriers and stuff, whereas in a lot of other Grant Morrison stories we have more kind of familiar characters in strange settings, where I think Grant Morrison is great at doing this quite natural dialogue, and here it's not a fault of the story at all that the dialogue is awkward or dramatic or weird, but it does have a very different feel to other Grant Morrison stories, and maybe is well done but not quite something that I super click with. I don't know.
Well,
No, I think that's fair. I think what I think Grant Morrison does mess a bit with dialogue with the Fates. I think the dialogue there was kind of Morrison-y. But I think that's fair. I get what Peter's trying to say. What do you think? Will?
I really enjoyed the dialogue in this. I do sometimes also struggle with like just when comics are written like every character sounds like they're saying a sonnet or something like that. That can sometimes feel a bit much, but I really didn't have that problem in this one. I felt like I understood everyone in the comic, and I felt like with all the Amazons and everything. And I liked the interaction between, you know, Diana and Steve Trevor, where there's a bit of a language barrier, and it's always like what I like is that usually the main presumed as an Amazonian, and then when a person speaking English, it's sort of in brackets to suggest we can't understand it. Diana calls Steve Trevor Trevor with a hyphen a lot, and I enjoyed all those elements. I didn't find it to be a nuisance, which I sometimes can in certain comics. In general, I found this whole comic just a really easy read. I think the nature of it being written as one graphic novel rather than single issues meant there's so much focus on like the art, and there's these big pages, and I felt like I just kept wanting to read on, and it's able to tell one story over, you know, 130 pages rather than just 20, you know, 5 issues of 20 pages. And I felt like that made it a really great read.
If you can get a hold of the compact edition, it does showcase the art really nicely despite its smaller size as well. I think the images are quite big, and it really works in that smaller format still, luckily.
So yeah, something I really liked in the art is, just remembering now, there's a couple panels where there's a white background and a big image of Wonder Woman next to an image of another group of characters that are shown as much smaller, are on sort of on the same background, and it sort of displays Wonder Woman's status and metaphorical size next to regular people, and I think that those were really awesome to see. Another thing I wanted to say about the Earth 1 sort of universe, and this being a version of the origin, I mentioned how like this feels like Grant Morrison's definitive version of the Wonder Woman origin, and I think that's because, like, in DC, continuities have been rewritten and rewritten so many times, and so many reboots, that the DC characters are much more like myths that have these constant but changing origins and constant but changing personalities. so that when you get a new version of their origin that's technically in a different universe, it still feels like a definitive Wonder Woman origin. And because of that, I would definitely recommend this to people as if they just wanted to read a Wonder Woman origin story, they could definitely read this, even though it's not in main continuity.
I'm really excited to see how this version of Wonder Woman kind of engages in the next few volumes with the rest of the world, because in an interesting way, I guess Wonder Woman is the most alien out of like the big three your Justice League members, right? Obviously Bruce is human, even though he's really edgy or whatever, and Clark is basically human, right? Like Diana isn't human at all. She is brand new to all this stuff. She finds it all kind of alien and is in many ways prejudiced against it still. Obviously she's less prejudiced than the rest of the Amazonians, but like I do think it's gonna be interesting to see, like, because the impression I was getting from kind of midway through this story is that she's only really interested in saving women, and I do think that that would be an interesting kind of 3-volume story. Either her, buckling, kind of hunkering down on that sort of ideology, or kind of moving towards, in the same way with Animal Man and Animal Problems, maybe she helps women with women problems, then will become a more fleshed out Justice League member. But I do think that's very interesting. I think I'm looking forward to see how it unravels a bit.
Well, I think the introduction of Black Steve Trevor, adding that element of intersectionality, is going to show us how men can also be victims of man's world. And
yeah.
I think that might be part of how the story grows as well.
Yeah, I think that's cool.
In terms of, because I've read a lot of Wonder Woman, especially this year, so just in terms of Wonder Woman origin stories, I just wanted to throw out some recommendations as well. Wonder Woman Earth 1, Wonder Woman Year 1, confusingly titled compared to this, by Greg Rucka, which I believe might have even come out the same year as this. It's confusing because it's Wonder Woman Rebirth Volume 2, Year 1, which is confusing. But you can read that by itself, and that's a great modern retelling of the Wonder Woman origin. That version actually has a white Steve Trevor and a black Etta Candy, or Beth Candy. But Greg Rucka writes the best version of white Steve Trevor that I've read. And then the 1986 George Perez Wonder Woman, it's literally just Wonder Woman issue 1. And then from there and on, it tells Wonder Woman's origin and then her first encounters with everything. And I think is the basis for so much of modern Wonder Woman as well. And that's a super definitive version of the origin as well. So those would definitely be my recommendations, just bouncing off of this comic.
Fire recommendations.
Yeah, man.
Yeah. I think this is a very solid comic. Generally speaking, I tend to prefer more modern comic art, so I found this a lot easier to read than perhaps like the Animal Man stuff. So I think if that tickles your fancy, definitely read this. But generally, my review would be like, if you're like obsessed with kind of Grant Morrison's writing style, like there is those elements here, right? And the quality is still there, but it's not the most Morrison-y story you're gonna see. So if that's what you're interested in, maybe you could give this a miss. However, like Leon was just saying, if you love Wonder Woman and you want a really good Wonder Woman origin story, I think it's perfect for you.
Are we all done? Any final thoughts?
Should we give our rating out of kangaroos?
Sure. I'm gonna give this 4 kangaroos and a Joey.
Ooh.
Okay, that's smart. That's smart.
Because I really enjoyed this. I thought it was a great, but I think there's a lot of things that are introduced that could fail or succeed in subsequent volumes. So that's why
Yeah,
it's not
that's
getting
fair.
5
That's fair.
kangaroos, but I am really excited about it.
What is this out of 5? Out of 5 kangaroos or out of 10?
I did out of 5.
I'd give it. Oh, I'm gonna sound harsh now after what you said. I'm gonna give it 2 kangaroos out of 5. I think I enjoyed reading it. However, I don't really see it beyond its very good value as a Wonder Woman origin story, which I think it does really well. I don't see the staying value that much. I don't see the staying power with this story. So that's why I give it 2.
Yeah, I think
But-
I'm going 3 kangaroos. It as a first volume out of 3, it gripped me. I think if I read that and had to wait, was it 2 years or 1 year? It was a long time
Yeah.
between them. I don't know if
It
that would have
was.
satisfied me as a single comic. I think it was quite
Hmm.
straightforward, but it was good. I think the art was the highlight for me. I
Yeah.
think
I
art
think the
was,
art definitely is the highlight.
yeah, definitely very impressive and yeah, particularly strong modern comic art.
Great.
Well, thanks guys.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you. Thank
see
you
you in
for
the next
tuning
one.
into the.
Say your bit.
Oh, okay. Thanks for tuning in to the Morrison run this week.
We'll see you in the next one when we continue with Wonder Woman Earth 1.
Thank you.
See ya.
Bye. Bye.